There's a thing men do when they've got money and you don't. They smile. Not a warm smile, the other kind, the kind that's already decided how the story ends before you've said a word. I saw that smile the day Harlan Voss handed a broke-down cowboy the ugliest, meanest, most useless horse in 3 counties, and told him, loud enough for the whole yard to hear, that a nothing man deserved a nothing animal. Everybody laughed. God help me, I laughed too. I've spent 30 years on the wrong end of my own conscience for that laugh. Because what happened after, what that quiet, ruined man did with that quiet, ruined horse, I still can't fully explain it. I've told it maybe 100 times at fires and funerals, and once to a preacher who didn't believe a word. And every time I get to the part where the impossible happened, I have to stop and breathe, because it does something to me even now. So sit close. Let the coffee go cold. This is the truest thing I know, and I'll tell it the only way I can, slow and honest and starting in the middle, the way the real ones always start. The dust hadn't even settled when Voss started laughing. I remember that first, the laugh before I understood what he was laughing at. It came rolling across the sale yard at the Bitterroot stock pens, big and easy, the laugh of a man who's never once in his life been told no. I was up on the top rail with a stub of pencil and my little tally book, marking lot numbers for Old Man Prout, and I looked up because a laugh like that pulls your eye whether you want it to or not. Voss stood in the center of the yard in a coat that cost more than I made in a season. Around him, his hands and hangers-on and the usual buzzards who circled money. And in front of him, holding a lead rope, stood a man I didn't know yet. The stranger was maybe 50. Could have been 40 and hard used, could have been 60 and stubborn. The range does that. Sands a man down until his years won't sit still on his face. His hat had lost its shape a long way back. His boots had been resoled with somebody else's leather. He had a coat too thin for the wind coming down off the Upsarokas, and he stood in it like the cold was just one more thing he'd made peace with. At the end of his rope stood the horse. Now I've handled a lot of horses. Good ones you remember for their eye. Bad ones you remember for their teeth. This one you remembered because it looked like it had already been to the killers and walked back out on spite alone. A gray gelding, though gray's a kind word, he was the color of a rained-on grave, patched with scars, ribs you could have played a fence-tune on. One ear had a notch bit clean through. He carried his head low and swung it side to side, slow, watching everybody the way a man watches a room he means to leave through the window. "Go on," Voss was saying, wiping his eyes. "Go on, take him, he's yours, free of charge." He turned to his crowd, playing them like a fiddle. "Man comes to my yard with no money, no outfit, asking to buy in on the fall gather. I'm a Christian, ain't I? I'll grubstake him, give him a horse and everything." He grinned. That horse. The crowd gave him his laugh. They always did. I found out the pieces later, the way you always find out the pieces later. The stranger's name was Amos Kettle. He'd had a little place up the Stillwater, him and a wife and a boy, and 2 winters back the diphtheria came through and took the boy in 4 days, and the grief took the wife slower than that, which is the crueler way. He'd sold off everything but a saddle and a name for whiskey he mostly beat and sometimes didn't. He'd come down to the Bitterroot looking to hire on for the season, because when a man's lost everything, work is the last thing that'll hold him upright, and Amos Kettle knew it. Voss knew all that too. That's the part that curdles it. Voss knew and used it. "Well," Voss said, "you gonna take him or stand there? I've got real business." And Amos Kettle looked at that horse. I want to tell you he looked at it with some kind of knowing, that there was a violin string of destiny that hummed between them right there in the yard. There wasn't. What I saw was a tired man look at a tired animal, and something pass over his face that I didn't have a name for at the time and have spent a long while nomming since. It wasn't pity exactly. Pity looks down. This looked across, like he was seeing something he recognized. "I'll take him," Amos said. First words I ever heard him speak. Quiet, flat. But he said thank you after, and that was the thing that stopped my pencil. He said thank you to a man who just used him for a joke, and he meant it because he'd been given a horse, and a horse was more than he'd had that morning. Voss's smile flickered, just for a second. A man like that wants his cruelty received as cruelty. Getting thanked for it, that's a splinter he can't reach. Don't thank me, Voss said, and the ease had gone thin. That animal's killed a man. Threw the Dawes boy last spring, broke his neck. Nobody'll get a saddle on him. You'll be walking by Thursday. He waved a glove. Somebody write his name down for the gather, Kettle, and put down whatever that thing is. His foreman, a slab of a man named Clee Docker, called out, "What do we call the horse, boss?" And Voss, who was already turning away, already bored, said the thing I still hear sometimes in that gap between sleep and morning. "Call him Buzzard Bait, 'cause that's where they're both headed." The yard laughed one more time, and I, 26 years old and wanting so bad to be liked by men I should have spit on, I laughed too. I wrote it in my tally book small in the corner like it was nothing. Kettle, Buzzard Bait, Fall Gather. 3 words. I've still got that book. The ink's gone brown. I can't look at that corner without my chest doing something. The Bitterroot Fall Gather was a big outfits affair. Near 40 riders pushing cattle down out of the high summer range before the snow shut the passes. Voss ran it like a small war, and he ran it to be watched running it. He'd made his money in a hurry, and he was the kind who needed everyone to keep seeing him have it. Amos Kettle and his gray got put at the tail. That's the joke position, and everyone knew it. Drag rider, eating everybody's dust, riding the slow and the lame and the calves that couldn't keep up. You put your worst man and your worst horse on drag. It's an insult with a job attached. First morning, we all watched to see if Amos could even mount up. He didn't try to. That's the thing that started it turning for me, though I didn't know it yet. Every other man in that camp threw a saddle on and climbed aboard, and Amos Kettle walked. He led that gray by a length of soft rope, on foot, out into the herd, and he worked drag on his own 2 feet like a man 40 years out of date. The other hands hooted. Docker rode by and asked did he need a wet nurse. Voss, when he heard, laughed his big laugh and said, "Let the fool walk. It's a free country and a free horse." But I was riding swing that first week, 1 position up from drag, and I could see what nobody bothered to look at. Amos never once got angry at that horse. You have to understand what strange is out there. Men beat horses. Not all men, but enough that it's ordinary, and a horse that's killed somebody, a horse that shies and bites and won't be caught. A man is expected to beat that horse or be beaten in the yard's estimation for failing too. And here was this ruined fellow, walking 12, 14 hours a day in the dust, and every time that gray flinched or spooked or tried to swing its haunches into him, Amos would just stop, stand still. Let the animal blow and roll its eyes. And then, low, so low I only caught it because the wind carried right, he'd talk to it. I never heard the words those first days, just the tone. It was the tone you'd use on a spooked child in the dark, on a dog that'd been kicked by the last 3 men who owned it. On yourself, maybe, at 3 in the morning when the grief comes and there's nobody left in the house to hear you. By the 3rd day, the gray would follow him, without the rope going tight. By the 5th, I saw the horse put its ugly notched-eared head over Amos's shoulder, while he ate his supper standing up, and Amos reached back without looking and rubbed the underside of its jaw, and the horse let out a breath big enough to move his hat. I didn't laugh at that. I didn't say anything to anybody. But that night I crossed something out in my tally book, small in the corner, and wrote something else, and I'm not going to tell you what yet because it belongs later. Here's the part where I have to be honest about myself, because a story where the man telling it comes off clean is a lie, and I promised you the truest thing I know. I could have stood up for Amos Kettle. I didn't. There was a night, maybe 10 days in, when Docker and a couple of the young hands decided the drag rider was a good target for the kind of fun that bored, cold, tired men reach for. They'd been drinking. They went out to where Amos bedded down apart from camp. He always bedded apart near his horse, and they roused him and made him stand up, and they poked at him. "Where's your outfit, old man?" That your wife's coat you're wearing, it's a woman's cut. Somebody said something about the boy. I don't know how they knew about the boy. Docker knew things. Voss's men made it their business to know the soft places in a man. I was awake. I heard it. I lay in my bedroll with my eyes open and my heart going, and I told myself it wasn't my business and a man's got to fight his own fights, and 40 other cowardly little sentences that men have been telling themselves since the first camp had a fire. And then I heard the horse. The gray came out of the dark. Didn't charge, that's what I expected, and it's not what happened. It walked slow into the ring of lantern light, and it put itself between Amos and the men. Just stood there, ugly and scarred and enormous in that low light. And it laid its ears flat and dropped its head and made a sound I'd never heard a horse make, a kind of low grinding in the chest, and Docker, big Clee Docker, who feared nothing that walked on 2 legs, Docker took a step back. "Call your beast off," he said, and his voice had gone up half a note. Amos didn't say anything, didn't call it off, just put one hand flat on the horse's neck, and the two of them stood there, the man and the animal, and something about it made the drunk go out of those men all at once. They found reasons to be elsewhere. Docker went last, walking backward, and the horse tracked him with its one good ear the whole way. When they were gone, Amos leaned his forehead against the gray's shoulder and stayed like that a long time. Long enough that I thought maybe he'd fallen asleep standing up. And I lay there in the dark, ashamed down to the soles of my feet, and I heard him say the first full sentence of his I ever made out clear. He said, "Easy now, easy, nobody's leaving, I'm right here." And I understood, lying there, that he wasn't only talking to the horse. The weather turned on the 17th day. I remember because Prout kept a calendar, and I'd been marking days toward my pay. It came down off the divide the way the bad ones do, no warning worth the name, just a sky that went the color of a bruise by noon and a wind that changed direction and brought the smell of snow when we still had 2 days of high country to clear. Voss should have moved us faster. Pride made him slow. He wanted to bring every last head down, wanted the tally to be the biggest anybody'd run off that range, because the number was the point. The number was always the point. So we pushed on into ground we should have been off of, and the storm caught us on the shoulder of a mountain called Sorrow Peak, which is a name somebody gave it for a reason I'd rather not have learned. The cattle scattered. That's what they do, they turn tail to the wind and drift, and a drifting herd in the mountains finds every gully and cliff and blind draw there is. Riders went out into the white to hold them and came back with ice in their beards, saying they couldn't see their own horses' ears. Voss was screaming orders nobody could hear. 2 hands were unaccounted for. And somewhere below us, in a fold of the mountain, a bunch of maybe 60 head had gone into a box canyon that dead-ended in a drop, and the drop was starting to fill with the animals that couldn't stop, and the animals behind that couldn't see and didn't know. And a boy went in after them. Not a boy quite. 15, 16. Voss's nephew, a soft kid named Toby who'd been brought along to be toughened and had spent the whole gather being miserable and homesick and mocked, same as Amos, though nobody'd handed him a horse to be mocked with. Toby saw the cattle going over and did the thing a green kid does, the brave, stupid thing, and rode into that box canyon to turn them, and his good horse, his fine, expensive, well-bred horse, did exactly what a sensible fine horse does when it's asked to go into a swirling white, nothing full of the smell of falling and dying. It refused. It planted its feet at the canyon mouth and would not go a step, and it fought the boy, and it threw him hard onto the ice and rock and bolted back the way it had come, empty saddle flapping, and left that child down and stunned in the mouth of a canyon that was turning into a grave, with the whole terrified press of cattle behind him grinding forward blind. I saw it. I was maybe 200 yards up the slope, holding my own terrified horse, and I saw the whole shape of it, and I could not make my animal go down there, and I am not ashamed of that because no sane man could have. You do not ride a horse into a stampeding herd in a whiteout in a box canyon. It is not bravery to try. It is just two deaths instead of one. That's what I was thinking, two deaths instead of one. And then, out of the white to my left, low to the ground and moving in that same unhurried walk that turned into something else, came the gray, with Amos Kettle on his back. I had never once in 17 days seen Amos ride that horse. Not once. He walked. Everyone knew he walked because the horse couldn't be ridden. The horse had killed a man. The horse was named Buzzard Bait for a joke. And here he was, up in a saddle I didn't even know he'd owned, bareheaded. He'd lost his hat somewhere in the storm, his thin coat cracking in the wind like a flag, riding that condemned animal straight down toward the one place on that whole mountain that no horse on earth would go. I opened my mouth to yell at him to stop. Nothing came out. He didn't stop. The last I saw of them before the snow closed up like a curtain, the very last, was the gray gathering itself at the canyon mouth where the fine horse had refused, dropping its scarred head and going in. Into the white, into the noise, into the impossible. And then I couldn't see anything at all. I'm going to slow down here, because this is the part I've never been able to tell fast. For a while there was only the storm. I stood on that slope holding my useless horse, and I could not see 10 feet, and the wind was a sound like the whole mountain grieving. And somewhere below me in the white, a broken-down man on a condemned horse had ridden into a stampede to reach a boy that everybody but him had already given up on, including me, especially me. I want to say I prayed. I think what I actually did was just say his name, Amos, over and over, quiet, the way he'd talked to that horse in the dark, as if a name said soft enough could reach through a blizzard and hold a man up. Time does a strange thing in a storm. It might have been 2 minutes, it might have been 20, but there came a point when I realized the sound had changed, that under the wind there was no longer that other sound, the grinding rumble of cattle in a panic, the noise of animals going over an edge. It had stopped. And I didn't know if that meant the worst had finished happening, or if it meant something else, and I could not make myself go down to find out, and I hated myself in a clean, bright way I'd never managed before. Then the wind tore a hole in the white, just for a second, the way it does. And through that hole I saw the mouth of the box canyon, and coming out of it slow, so slow, 1 foot and then another foot, picking through the churned red snow, I saw the gray. He was walking, head low, sides heaving, a long gash open on his shoulder that steamed in the cold, and he was leading. Behind him, packed close and calm, came the cattle, not falling, not fighting, following. 60 head of terrified animals walking out of a death trap in a neat file behind a scarred gray gelding like children behind a schoolmarm, because somehow in there, in the noise and the blind and the falling, that horse had turned them, had put himself in front of the panic, and made the panic follow him instead of the edge. And on his back, slumped low over the mane with both arms wrapped around the boy, with Toby held against his chest like something he would die before he dropped, was Amos Kettle. Alive, both of them alive. I have tried for 30 years to find the words for what came up in me at that sight, and I have never once managed it, so I'll just tell you what I did. I let go of my horse, and I ran down that slope on foot, falling, sliding, and I was making some sound that wasn't crying and wasn't laughing and was maybe both, and I was the first one to reach him. He looked at me. His lips were gray. There was blood on him, but I never did find out whose. And the first thing that ruined, exhausted man said to me, the first thing was not help me. It was, get the boy warm, he's shocked. Get him warm and don't let him sleep. He was still thinking of somebody else, even then, even coming out of that. We got Toby down. We got Amos down, and when his feet hit the ground, his legs went from under him and I caught him. And up close I could see he was hurt worse than he'd let on. Something wrong in the way he held his side. A rib or 3 where the cattle had pressed him against the canyon wall. He'd ridden out of there on will alone. He should not have been able to sit that horse. He'd done it anyway because the alternative was a boy dying, and Amos Kettle had already buried 1 boy and was not, whatever it cost him, whatever was left of him after, going to stand by and let it happen to another one. That was the morally heavy thing, if you're keeping count of such things. It wasn't a speech. Nobody gave him a choice to agonize over out loud. The heavy thing was that a man with nothing left, a man the whole camp had spent 17 days grinding down, spent the only thing he had, the last of his own body, on a stranger's child, and did it without 1 second of hesitation that I could see. The hesitation, the doubt, all of that had happened years before, in a house on the Stillwater, and he'd already decided on the far side of it what kind of man the grief was going to let him be. Voss came, of course. Voss came when the storm broke and the tally could be counted, the way that kind of man always arrives once the danger's done and the crediting's begun. He came down to where we had Amos propped against a rock with a blanket, and the boy Toby wrapped up next to him, refusing to let go of Amos's sleeve, and Voss stood over the two of them, and you could watch the arithmetic go across his face. The nephew saved. His sister's boy, that he'd have had to explain a body to. 60 head brought out alive that everyone had written off, and all of it done by the man he'd handed a joke to in a sale yard, on the horse he'd named Buzzard Bait for the laugh of it. I'll give Voss one thing, I could see it cost him. There was a moment I watched for it, I wanted it, where the man understood exactly what he'd done and exactly what had been done in return, and where the sheer weight of it went across him like a shadow. He knew. Right then he knew. And then he did what men like him do, which is reach for the shape of it that lets him keep being who he is. "Well," Voss said too loud to the hands gathering around, "I told you there was a good horse in there somewhere. Man's just got to know how to bring it out." He clapped his gloves together. "That's Bitterroot stock for you." And that was going to be the story. I could feel it setting up like cold tallow right there in front of me, the version Voss would tell, where his generosity gave a down-and-out man a chance, where his good Bitterroot horse showed its quality, where the whole thing redounded somehow to Harlan Voss's credit. He'd tell it at dinners. He'd tell it until it was true. And Amos Kettle, who couldn't afford a lawyer or a loud voice or even a whole coat, would have his one impossible thing taken from him and hung on Voss's wall like a trophy, the way Voss took everything. I stood there and I felt the old cowardice rise up, the "it's not my business," and this time, this one time in my life, I didn't let it win. I stepped up next to Amos in front of the whole gather, and I opened my tally book to the corner of the first page, and I read out loud what I'd written the morning of the sale in Voss's own words. Kettle, Buzzard Bait, headed for the killers both. And then I turned to the page from the 5th night where I'd crossed out that ugly name and written a different one, the thing I told you belonged later. I'd written, "The horse doesn't have a bad name. He had bad men. Kettle knows the difference." I read that out too. My voice shook. I'm not a brave man, and it's the bravest thing I ever did, and it wasn't even very brave. It was just a coward finally saying a true thing out loud in front of people who'd rather he didn't. "That's not your horse's quality, Mr. Voss," I said. "That's his." I nodded at Amos. "You gave a grieving man the animal you meant to break him with, and he didn't break it and it didn't break him. They just recognized each other." I ran out of steam. I'm no orator. That's all. That's the whole thing. And everybody standing here saw it, so nobody's going to be telling it any other way. It was quiet a while. And then, of all people, it was Docker, Big Clee Docker, who'd gone out drunk to torment Amos in the dark, who took his hat off. Just took it off and held it. And one by one, in that busted-up, embarrassed way men have, the rest of them did too. Not for Voss. For the man on the ground and the horse standing over him with the steam coming off its wound, refusing even now to be led away, planted between Amos and the world same as it had planted itself that night by the fire. Voss looked around at his own men holding their hats, and I watched him understand that the story had gotten away from him, that for once he couldn't buy it back or shout it down. And he did the only thing left that a man like that can do, which is decide it had been his idea all along to be generous, and turn and walk off, and never speak of it again. He paid Amos, though, full wages and a bonus he called his own idea, I think it was the closest thing to shame Harlan Voss had in him. Coin instead of an apology, because coin was the only language he was fluent in. Amos took it. A man with a hurt side and a hungry winter coming takes the coin, but he didn't say thank you that time. I noticed. He'd thanked Voss for a joke in the sale yard, and he did not thank him for the money, and I understood the difference. And I think, somewhere underneath, so did Voss. They didn't ride off into anything golden. I want to be honest with you clear to the end. Amos Kettle's ribs healed wrong, the way ribs do when a man won't lie still and let them knit. He walked with a hitch after that, worse in the cold, which up there is most of the year. He never got rich. He hired on at a little outfit down the Stillwater, back near where his old place had been, near the ground where his boy was buried, and I think that was the point of it for him, to be close to that ground, and to have something living to look after, so the closeness didn't finish him. The gray went with him. Of course the gray went with him. Voss, in the one decent gesture of his life, signed the animal over free and clear, though I suspect it was less decency than not wanting to keep a horse that reminded him daily of the morning the whole camp took their hats off for another man. Amos never did rename him, not officially. But I heard, years on, that the kids at that little outfit called the gray Buzz, and that it had lost all its meaning and just become the name of a gentle old horse that let toddlers hang off its neck and would stand for hours in the yard like it was waiting for somebody to come home. I saw Amos one more time, 6, 7 years later at a stock sale in Big Timber. He was older and the hitch was worse and his coat was still too thin, but there was something eased in his face that hadn't been there in the sale yard. Some not the years had worked loose. We talked a while. I told him, because I'd carried it and it was heavy, that I'd laughed that first morning, that I'd written his horse's cruel name in my book like it was nothing, that I'd lain awake the night they came for him and done nothing until the horse did it for me. I told him all of it, the whole shameful account, because I'd promised myself if I ever saw the man again I'd give him the truth, even if it cost me his good opinion. He listened. He didn't rush to make me feel better about it, which is how I knew he was taking it seriously and not just being kind. And then he said the thing I've built the rest of my life around, more or less. He said, "You didn't do nothing that night. You stayed awake." He looked at me steady. Most men would have made themselves sleep. That's all. He let me off with that, which was more than I'd earned and exactly what I could carry. I asked after the horse. His face did something then, that same look from the sale yard, the one that isn't pity and isn't destiny, the one that looks across. And he told me Buzz had died that spring. Just laid down in the yard in the sun and didn't get up. Old. Easy. In his sleep, with the kids nearby and the mountain in the light and no storm anywhere near. Good end, I said, because it was, and because I didn't know what else. Amos nodded. He looked off at the pens a while, at all the horses and all the men doing their arithmetic on them the way men do. He waited for me to come home from town, Amos said finally. That morning, my wife's people said he'd been standing at the gate since before light watching the road. He stopped. His jaw worked. Waited till I got down and put my hand on him. Then he laid down. He didn't say anything after that. Neither did I. We stood there at the rail a while longer, 2 old men in the sun. And then somebody called a lot number and the day went on the way days do. I never saw him again. I heard he passed a few winters later, quiet in the little house near his boy's grave, and I like to think, I have no evidence, I just like to think that, whatever's on the far side of all this, there was a scarred gray horse standing at a gate somewhere, watching the road, waiting to walk him in. I still have the tally book. I'm looking at it now. The ugly names crossed out, the true things written underneath. And in the corner of the last page, in a hand shakier than it used to be, I've kept adding to it over the years, every time I get to telling this, the same 3 words, because they're the only ending I've ever found that doesn't lie.